tonight, I find myself remembering the Alpine passes, the way morning mist clung to monastery walls, and how the scratch of quill on parchment marked the slow rhythm of mountain life. This is history as it was lived and hurried, unpolished, real. If this quiet approach to the past helps you unwind, a like would mean a lot. Subscribe if you'd like to join me for more slow journeys through history. Tell me in the comments where tonight finds you listening, and what draws you to these forgotten corners of medieval Europe. Dim the lights, let's drift back to those weathered souls moving at the pace of survival, where ledgers held truths the histories never recorded. From my window in the guest quarters, I could see the ancient Roman road winding down through the valley, the Via Claudia Augusta. They called it once, when emperors' commands still echoed through these mountains. Now it carried different cargo and different secrets. Aldrich's fingers, stained black from years of ink, moved across the parchment with practiced care. The abbey's provisions, he wrote, grain from the valley farms, salt from the mines beyond Innsbruck, wine from the monastery's own vineyards, blessed by Brother Matthias, and stored in the deep cellars where the mountain's chill kept it sweet through summer's heat. But there were other entries too, written in the same careful hand, yet somehow different. Donations from generous merchants, the ledger claimed, gifts for the poor, distributed through the porter's careful hands, yet the numbers told a curious tale. Donations that arrived precisely when certain merchants passed through, gifts that somehow required the monastery's pack mules to journey far beyond the valley's edge. I remember watching Aldrich that autumn evening as the first snow dusted the peaks above us. His face, lined by 50 winters in these mountains, bore the weight of more than simple arithmetic. The cellarer's duties were manifold, managing the abbey's stores, overseeing the bakehouse where Brother Thomas needed tomorrow's bread, ensuring that the brewhouse produced enough ale for the community and the endless stream of travelers who sought shelter within these walls. The rule of Saint Benedict granted him freedoms that other monks did not possess. He could speak with visitors without permission, could leave the refectory when duties called, could even miss the night offices if the abbey's provisions demanded his attention. These privileges, born of practical necessity, had evolved over the decades into something more flexible, more ... useful. The salt merchants from Hall, Aldrich murmured to himself, his quill pausing above the parchment. 30 bushels of white salt carried by mule train, payment ... recorded as donation for the poor. But I had seen those mule trains, watched them through the narrow window that looked down upon the courtyard. The sacks they carried bore the weight of salt, yes, but also the heavier burden of silver coins sewn into hidden pockets, Islamic dirhams from distant Baghdad. Their Arabic script for and against these Christian mountains, the salt was real enough, necessary for preserving meat through the long winter months. Yet it served another purpose too, its bulk and commonness providing perfect concealment for smaller, more valuable cargo. The monastery's tax exemptions made such arrangements. Convenient church property, blessed by papal decree, bore no burden of the road tolls that plagued secular merchants. No count or duke could demand payment from monks carrying provisions for their community. No imperial official could search wagons bearing grain and wine to feed the poor. What had begun as spiritual privilege had become, in Aldrich's careful hands, something more pragmatic. The ledger's pages rustled as he turned to the accounts for the coming week. Giovanni di Milano would arrive with his usual cargo silk from the looms of Byzantium, or so his manifest would claim. The rolls of fabric would be logged as altar cloths, donations from a pious merchant seeking prayers for his departed wife. Only Aldrich would know that beneath the legitimate silk lay other treasures. Spices from the markets of Alexandria, glass beads from the furnaces of Murano, goods that bore no stamp of imperial approval, no record of taxes paid. The scratching of his quill filled the silence, a rhythm as steady as the mountain winds that never ceased their whisper around these ancient walls. Each entry told two stories, one for the bishop's yearly inspection, another for the merchants who understood the true cost of moving valuable goods across borders, where every local lord demanded his share. I remember the moment when Aldrich set down his quill and rubbed his tired eyes. The candle had burned low, its flame dancing in the draughts that crept through stone joints laid 6 centuries past. For just an instant, his face showed the weight of what he carried, not just the responsibility for feeding 60 monks and countless pilgrims, but the delicate balance between spiritual duty and earthly necessity. The monastery needed income beyond what its lands could provide. The harsh winters, the demands of hospitality, the endless repairs required by buildings that fought a constant battle against wind and weather. All of this cost more than tithes and donations could supply. If certain merchants found it convenient to store their goods in monastery cellars, if certain shipments traveled more easily under the protection of religious privilege, if certain ledgers recorded transactions in language that satisfied both conscience and canon law, well, these were matters for the cellarer's careful judgment. As the candle guttered and died, Aldrich closed his ledger and secured it with leather straps. Tomorrow would bring new entries, new balances to strike between the written word and the unspoken truth. The mountain roads would carry their usual traffic pilgrims bound for Rome, merchants seeking passage to the German markets, and always the patient mule trains bearing cargo that might or might not be exactly what their manifests claimed. The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters and sending a draught across the scriptorium floor. Winter was coming early this year, and with it the familiar challenges of survival in these high places where every decision balanced on the knife's edge between righteousness and necessity. In the darkness, I could hear the distant sound of hoofbeats on stone, another merchant arriving under cover of night, another entry waiting to be made in Aldrich's careful books. The mountain roads never truly slept, and neither did the quiet commerce that flowed through these passes, like water finding its way to the sea. The ledgers told their stories in numbers and careful words, but the truth lived in the spaces between the lines, in the understanding that passed between men who knew that survival sometimes required more creativity than scripture might strictly allow. It was a truth as old as these mountains themselves, where the wind and weather cared nothing for human law, and where those who endured learned to bend with the storms, rather than break against them. The monastery of St. Bernulf sat like a fortress against the Alpine slopes, its thick walls built to withstand both winter storms and the curious eyes of passing merchants. From the valley below, torchlight flickered along the Roman road. As another caravan made its way toward the monastery gates, the driver would claim to carry grain for the poor, his manifests stamped with the seals of distant lords who had never seen the contents of his wagons. Brother Aldrich would rise from his prayers, wrap his cloak against the mountain cold, and make his way to the gatehouse where the porter waited with his questions and his keys. Another entry for the ledger, another careful balance between what was written and what was understood. The wind carried the scent of snow and distant places, spices from markets he had never seen, salt from mines carved deep into foreign mountains, the promise of silver that would keep the monastery's fires burning through another harsh winter. In the scriptorium, the empty ledger waited for tomorrow's entries, its blank pages ready to record another day's careful dance between divine duty and earthly survival. The mountain roads would wake with the dawn, and with them the quiet commerce that had flowed through these passes since Roman legions first carved their highways into living stone. I remember the morning when the salt merchants arrived from Hall, their mule train winding down the mountain path like a dark ribbon against the autumn snow. The lead rider was Hans, a weathered man whose beard had gone grey from 20 years of Alpine winters, and behind him came the patient procession of pack animals, their breath steaming in the cold air as they picked their way across stones that Roman legions had trod 1,000 years before. Margot walked beside the lead mule, her hand resting easily on the animal's neck. She was perhaps 40 winters old, though the mountain sun and wind had carved lines around her eyes that might have belonged to a woman of 60 in the valley below. Her cloak was patched with leather, her boots worn smooth by countless journeys across these treacherous paths, and in her weathered face lived the kind of knowledge that could not be learned from books or prayers. The mules carried 30 bushels of salt, as Aldrich's ledger would duly record, white salt from the mines near Hall, where men descended into the earth to harvest what they called white gold, precious as silver in these mountain communities, where meat must be preserved through months, when no fresh food could reach the high places. But I watched from the guest-house window as the mules were led not to the main courtyard where such deliveries usually took place, but around to the smaller yard behind the brewhouse, where Brother Thomas kept his malt stores, and where the stone walls blocked the view from the road. Aldrich emerged from the scriptorium, moving with the unhurried pace of a man who had performed this ritual many times before. He wore his brown habit and carried a wooden tablet for recording the transaction, looking for all the world like any cellarer accepting provisions for his community. Yet I noticed how his eyes swept the mountainsides, checking for travelers on the road, before he nodded to Margot. The first sacks were lifted down, heavy with the coarse salt that would fill the monastery stores. But as the unloading continued, I saw Margot's fingers working at certain sacks with practiced skill, loosening stitches that had been carefully sewn to come apart at just such a moment. From within the salt, she drew smaller packages wrapped in oiled cloth packages that clinked softly with the sound of metal on metal. Silver, Islamic dirhams, from the markets of Baghdad and Damascus, each coin bearing the flowing script of a distant caliph, each one worth more than a monastery's annual tithes. They had travelled far to reach this mountain courtyard across the trade routes of the East, through the hands of Venetian merchants who asked no questions about origins, and now hidden within salt sacks that would excite no suspicion from any customs, official or road warden. Hans, the salt merchant, kept careful watch on the road, while this secondary unloading took place. His arrangement with the monastery was simple. He provided legitimate salt at fair prices, and in return, certain other cargo could travel under the protection of his merchant's license. The risk was small who would suspect a monastery of trafficking in foreign silver, and the payment generous enough to make the occasional winter journey profitable, even when the passes grew treacherous. I remember watching as Aldrich examined one of the silver pieces, holding it up to catch the morning light. The coin was beautiful in its way, marked with Arabic calligraphy that spoke of empires far beyond these Christian mountains. Such coins had been flowing northward for centuries, following trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Baltic, the Islamic world to the courts of German kings. 30 bushels, Aldrich murmured, making his mark on the wooden tablet. Payment recorded as donation for the poor. The words had become ritual, a formula that satisfied both ledger and conscience. The monastery would indeed distribute salt to the needy families in the valley below, fulfilling the letter of the recorded transactions. That additional silver would find its way into different hands. Funding different purposes was a detail that need not trouble the official records. Margot supervised the careful rewrapping of the silver, ensuring that each package was secured against moisture and discovery. Some would remain hidden in the monastery's own stores, tucked away in corners of the cellar where only Aldrich's trusted hands would find them. Others would continue their journey northward, carried by different merchants to the German markets where Islamic silver was always welcome, where questions about provenance were rarely asked if the weight and purity proved genuine. The emptied salt sacks were refilled with legitimate salt, their stitching restored to hide any sign of tampering. By the time Hans led his mule train back onto the mountain road, heading north toward the Brenner Pass, every animal carried exactly what its manifest claimed salt for the communities that dotted the Alpine valleys. Salt that would preserve meat and flavor bread through the long winter months ahead. But the silver remained hidden in the shadows of the monastery's ancient walls. Some would be used to purchase goods that the community needed, but could not produce cyan for tools, fine cloth for altar vestments, wine from distant vineyards where the sun burned warmer than it ever did in these high places. Other coins would be carefully hoarded, insurance against the harsh realities of mountain life, where a failed harvest or a particularly brutal winter could mean the difference between survival and starvation. I remember the quiet that settled over the courtyard once the merchants had departed. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the frost that silver-edged every blade of grass, and the monastery returned to its usual rhythms of prayer and labor. In the scriptorium, Aldrich would add his careful entry to the ledger, recording a transaction that was both completely truthful and utterly incomplete. The salt would be distributed as promised, feeding the poor and preserving the monastery's own stores. The silver would remain hidden, a secret shared between the cellarer and the few brothers who had learned that survival in these mountains sometimes required compromises that the rule of Saint Benedict had perhaps not fully contemplated. It was a balance as delicate as the mountain weather itself, where a single miscalculation could bring disaster, but where success meant the difference between mere existence and true prosperity. As the day wore on, other travelers passed along the Roman road, pilgrims bound for Rome, merchants carrying legitimate cargo, officials whose authority extended only as far as their ability to enforce it in these remote places. None of them knew that they rode past wealth beyond their imagining, silver coins that had traveled half the world to find rest in the shadows of a monastery cellar, where patient hands would measure them out as carefully as any miser counting his hoard. The mountain roads carried many secrets in those days, and the salt merchants from Hall were just one thread in a web that stretched from the spice markets of the east to the courts of German princes. But here, in this small courtyard behind the brewhouse, the grand currents of international commerce reduced to their simplest terms. Men with goods to move, routes to travel, and the eternal challenge of turning profit while avoiding the attention of those who would claim their share through tax or confiscation. The silver lay safe in the darkness, waiting for its next journey, while above the monastery bells marked the hours with their ancient rhythm, calling the faithful to prayer and reminding all who heard them that some truths were meant to be spoken aloud, while others were better kept in the spaces between heartbeats, in the silence that lived between the chimes. Each bushel was worth a day's wages for a skilled craftsman, and the monastery would pay the merchants fairly, as befitted a transaction between honest Christians. But I watched from the guest house window as the mules were led not to the main courtyard where such deliveries usually took place, but around to the smaller yard behind the brewhouse. There, in the shadow of the ancient walls, the true nature of this delivery would be revealed. Aldrich emerged from the scriptorium, moving with the unhurried pace of a man who had performed this ritual many times before. Here in the Alps, they served a different purpose, providing liquid wealth that could be easily hidden, easily transported, and easily converted to local currency when the need arose. 30 bushels, Aldrich murmured, making his mark on the wooden tablet. Payment recorded as donation for the poor. The words had become ritual, a formula that satisfied both ledger and conscience. The monastery would indeed distribute salt to the needy families in the valley below, fulfilling the letter of the recorded transaction. That additional silver would find its way into different hands, funding different purposes, was a detail that need not trouble the official records. Margot supervised the careful rewrapping of the silver, ensuring that each package was secured against moisture and discovery. I remembered the morning mist clinging to the stone like fingers reluctant to let go. The ancient road stretched before us, each block worn smooth by centuries of boots, hooves, and wheels. First Roman legions marching north to conquer the Germanic tribes, then merchants hauling goods between the empire's distant corners. Now our small caravan moving quietly through the grey dawn with cargo that bore no official seal. The Via Claudia Augusta had once been the pride of engineers who carved it through these mountains 400 years before Christ walked among men. I could still see their precision in the way each stone fitted against its neighbor, the careful grade that never climbed too steeply for a loaded wagon, the drainage channels that carried away the mountain's tears. But time had been patient and persistent. Frost had worked into the joints, splitting some blocks apart. Streams had found new courses, washing away entire sections. In places, grass and small trees had pushed through, making the road look more like a suggestion than a command. Margot walked beside her lead mule, one hand resting on the animal's neck in a gesture so natural it seemed they had been born connected. The mule, a sturdy brown creature with knowing eyes, picked its way over the uneven stones with the careful attention of an animal that understood the cost of a misstep. Behind them, 5 more mules followed in single file, their panniers packed with what appeared to be ordinary monastery supplies, grain sacks, wine casks, bundles of rough cloth. The Romans knew their business, Margot said, her voice barely above a whisper in the morning stillness. But they built for conquest, not discretion. I watched her examine a section where the road curved around a steep outcrop, her weathered face reading the terrain like Brother Aldrich read his ledgers. She had grown up in these mountains, born to a family that had guided travelers through the passes for generations. before the current lords began demanding their endless tolls. Her father had shown her the old paths, when she was barely tall enough to reach a mule's bridle, teaching her which stones would hold underweight, which shadows meant loose rock above, which changes in the wind warned of weather coming in from the south. The main road would have taken us directly through the valley where Count Heinrich's men waited with their tax collectors and their endless questions about manifests and destinations. But Margot knew other wise paths the Romans had built as secondary routes, shepherd tracks that connected to forgotten segments of imperial engineering, game trails that deer had carved along ridgelines where no official would think to look. She led us off the main road and onto a narrow track that seemed to disappear into a stand of mountain pines. The trees closed around us, their branches heavy with dew that dripped steadily onto the mules' backs. The animals moved more carefully here, feeling their way over roots and loose stones, their breathing visible in small clouds in the cool air. I could hear the distant sound of water running somewhere to our left, probably one of the streams that fed into the valley below. This connects back to the Via Recia, about 2 hours ahead, Margot explained, pausing to let the mules rest beside a section of ancient stonework that emerged from the forest floor like the backbone of some buried giant. The Romans built it as a military road when they were having trouble with the Vindelici tribes. Most people have forgotten it exists. I knelt and brushed pine needles away from the stones. Even here, hidden under centuries of leaf fall and forest growth, the Roman work remained solid. The blocks had been cut to fit together without mortar, each one shaped so precisely that winter frost could not find a weakness to exploit. Moss covered much of the surface now, and small ferns had rooted in the accumulated soil, but the foundation held firm. Brother Aldrich would have appreciated the craftsmanship, I thought. He had that same attention to lasting work in the way he managed the monastery's buildings, always thinking decades ahead, planning repairs before they became necessary. It was one of the qualities that made him such a valuable partner in our arrangement. He understood that sustainability required patience and care for details that others might overlook. We climbed steadily through the morning, the ancient road leading us along the shoulder of the mountain, sometimes emerging into clearings where we could see the main valley far below, sometimes disappearing into groves of beech and oak, where the canopy filtered the sunlight into moving patterns on the stone. Margot moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in this landscape, never hurrying, never hesitating, always seeming to know exactly where the next secure foothold would be. The mules, too, had settled into their rhythm. These were not the pampered animals that carried nobles on their hunts, but working creatures bred for endurance and sure-footedness. Their coats were thick and rough, their legs sturdy, their temperaments calm enough to handle the stress of mountain travel. Margot had chosen each one carefully, not just for their physical capabilities, but for their personalities and morals, that would not panic if they encountered unexpected obstacles, that would trust their human guide even when the path seemed to lead nowhere. In the second pannier of the third mule, wrapped in rough cloth and nestled between sacks of barley, lay Giovanni's latest acquisition, 3 bolts of silk that had travelled from somewhere beyond the edge of the known world. The silk had begun its journey in the workshops of distant Cathay, carried by caravans across deserts and mountains whose names I had never heard. It had reached Constantinople wrapped in the diplomatic baggage of an ambassador. been quietly sold to a Venetian trader who understood its true value, and now rode through these Alpine passes disguised as monastery provisions. The irony was not lost on me that this ancient Roman road, built to carry the empire's authority into barbarian lands, now served to move goods in defiance of imperial taxes. The stones that had once echoed with the measured step of legions now felt the softer tread of mules carrying contraband. The empire had fragmented into dozens of competing authorities, each demanding its tribute, each jealously guarding its prerogatives. But the roads remained waiting to serve whoever had the knowledge and courage to use them. Margot called a halt near a section where a small stream crossed the path, creating a natural watering place. The mules lowered their heads gratefully to drink while she checked their loads, running her hands along the leather straps to ensure nothing had shifted during the climb. Her movements were methodical, practiced, the result of years spent learning that a loose strap could mean disaster on a narrow mountain track. "The next stretch is more exposed," she said, straightening up from her inspection. "We'll be able to see the main road, but anyone down there will be able to see us too." I looked ahead to where the path curved around a bare shoulder of rock. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing patches of the valley below where the official trade route wound between villages and toll stations. From up here, the legitimate merchants would look like a line of ants carrying crumbs, moving in the prescribed patterns that authority demanded. But we would be invisible to them, just another shadow moving along the mountainside, indistinguishable from the play of clouds and wind in the high places where only shepherds and smugglers chose to venture. The Romans had built their roads to last 1,000 years, but they could not have imagined that their greatest legacy would be teaching later generations that there was always another way through the mountains. Margot clicked her tongue softly, and the mules raised their heads from the stream, water still dripping from their muzzles. We resumed our climb, following stones laid down by engineers who served Caesars whose names had become legends. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning away the mist, revealing the true scale of the mountains around Uspic after peak receding into blue distance. Each one a barrier that had stopped armies but could not stop the patience, movement of goods, and the quiet determination of people who understood that survival often required finding ways around the official world. The path ahead disappeared into shadow between two towering pines, leading us deeper into the network of forgotten roads that Margot carried in her memory, like Brother Aldrich carried his prayers. Somewhere behind us, Count Heinrich's tax collectors waited beside the main road, counting the official caravans, recording their cargoes, collecting their fees. But the mountains were vast and patient, full of paths that predated their authority, and the ancient stones beneath our feet remembered older loyalties than any duke or count could claim. I remember the weight of silence in the monastery chapel during the hour before dawn, when Brother Aldrich knelt in prayer while the rest of us still lay sleeping. The stone floor was cold beneath his knees, the kind of cold that seeped through wool and flesh to settle in the bones. But he remained motionless in the darkness, his breath visible in small clouds that rose and vanished in the shadows above the altar. The rule of Saint Benedict was clear about commerce. A monk should own nothing, desire nothing beyond his daily bread and the salvation of his soul. The buying and selling that consumed the world beyond the monastery walls was vanity, a distraction from the true work of prayer and contemplation. Yet here was Brother Aldrich, cellarer of the abbey, keeper of the storehouse, manager of provisions, wrestling with ledgers that told a different story than the one Saint Benedict had written 3 centuries before. The monastery needed grain for the bakehouse, wine for the altar, oil for the lamps that burned through the long winter nights. It needed warm robes for the brothers, leather for book bindings, parchment for the scriptorium where patient scribes copied texts that preserved knowledge from the ancient world. It needed silver for the cup that held the sacred wine, gold for the altar cross, copper for the bells that called the faithful to prayer. And all of these things had to come from somewhere, purchased with something, transported by someone who understood the dangerous realities of mountain roads and competing authorities. Brother Aldrich rose from his knees and made his way through the corridors toward the cellarium, his sandaled feet making no sound on the stone floor. The monastery was built around a central courtyard, its walls thick enough to keep out the mountain cold and strong enough to discourage bandits, who sometimes looked upon monastic wealth with covetous eyes. The cellarium occupied the ground floor of the western range, close to the main gate where deliveries could be received without disturbing the contemplative life of the community. He lit a tallow candle from the flame that burned perpetually before the altar, cupping his hand around the small light as he made his way down the narrow staircase to the storage chambers. The flame cast moving shadows on the walls, revealing glimpses of the monastery's careful accumulation barrels of wine from the abbey's own vineyard, sacks of grain from farms that paid their rents in kind, bundles of cloth woven by the lay brothers who lived just outside the main enclosure. But there were other things here too, items that appeared in no official inventory, goods that had arrived without accompanying documents or bills of sale. A small chest hidden beneath a stack of rough blankets, containing silver coins that bore the image of distant caliphs, bolts of silk wrapped in coarse linen, their true nature disguised, but their quality unmistakable to anyone who knew the difference between local wool and the precious thread that came from lands beyond imagination. Packets of spices nestled among sacks of ordinary salt, their exotic scents carefully masked but still detectable to a nose that knew what to seek. Brother Aldrich set his candle on the wooden table where he kept his records and opened the ledger. That told the monastery's official story. Each entry was carefully written in his precise script donations received, supplies purchased, expenses recorded with the methodical attention that 20 years of monastic discipline had bred into his bones. But between the lines, in the spaces where ink did not fall, lay another accounting entirely. The monastery had been founded 70 years earlier by a Saxon nobleman who sought to atone for a lifetime of warfare by establishing a community dedicated to prayer and scholarship. He had endowed it generously, granting it lands and privileges, securing papal approval for its special status. But the world had grown more complicated since those founding days. The Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope were locked in their great struggle over who held ultimate authority, and in the chaos of their conflict, local lords had seized ever more power for themselves. Count Heinrich controlled the main pass that led north toward the German markets. Duke Berthold demanded tribute from merchants traveling the southern routes toward Italy. Bishop Konrad claimed ecclesiastical authority over any goods that might be considered religious in nature. Each had his own officials, his own guards, his own endless appetite for taxes and fees. A legitimate merchant traveling from Venice to Augsburg might pay tribute to a dozen different authorities, each transaction recorded in duplicate, each official taking his percentage. The monastery, by virtue of its papal charter, enjoyed certain exemptions: goods destined for religious use, supplies necessary for the community's survival. Donations from pious benefactors, these could pass through many checkpoints without payment. Brother Aldrich had not set out to become a smuggler. The transformation had been gradual, born of necessity rather than greed. It began with small compromises: a merchant's request to store goods temporarily in the monastery's warehouses, a favor done for a friend who needed to move valuable items safely through dangerous territory. He opened the smaller ledger where he recorded these shadow transactions, writing by the flickering candlelight that turned his careful numerals into dancing spirits. Behind him, in the darkness of the cellarium, the hidden goods waited patiently for their transformation from contraband into grace. I remember the smell of Venice before I could see its salt and tar and the sweet decay of seaweed mingled with the sharper scents of spices and perfumes from distant lands. The morning mist hung low over the lagoon, transforming the approaching city into something that seemed to float between water and sky, its towers and domes emerging from the grey like the dreams of merchants made manifest in stone and timber. Giovanni stood at the prow of the shallow draft boat that carried us across the last stretch of water toward the Rialto, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he watched the familiar skyline take shape through the haze. He had made this journey hundreds of times over the past 20 years, but there was still something in his expression that suggested wonder, the look of a man who never quite got used to the miracle of a city built on nothing more solid than wooden piles driven into mud and ambition. The boatman, a sun-darkened Venetian whose family had been ferrying passengers across these waters since the city's founding, worked his long oar with the effortless rhythm of generations of practice. His boat was built for these shallow channels, its hull shaped to glide over sandbanks that would ground deeper vessels, its draft so modest it could navigate passages where larger ships would find themselves trapped by the shifting tides. As we drew closer, the sounds of the city reached us across the watery creak of rigging, the splash of oars, the calls of merchants advertising their wares in a dozen languages. Venice in the morning was a symphony of commerce, every voice contributing to the great song of buying and selling that had made this collection of muddy islands into the wealthiest city in the Mediterranean. The Rialto market was already alive with activity when we tied up at one of the countless small docks that lined the canals. Merchants from Byzantium haggled over bolts of silk while their Genoese competitors examined spices from Alexandria. German silver changed hands beside bales of English wool. Flemish cloth was weighed and measured next to barrels of Spanish wine. The whole world seemed to flow through this single square mile of floating civilization. Goods and gold and gossip moving along currents as complex as the tides that lifted and lowered the city twice each day. Giovanni led me through the maze of stalls and warehouses toward a narrow building wedged between a spice merchant's shop and a goldsmith's workshop. The building's facade was unremarkable weathered stone below, timber and plaster above, small windows that revealed little of what lay within, but I could smell the treasures it contained: the green scent of cardamom, the warm bite of cinnamon, the mysterious sweetness of frankincense from the courts of distant caliphs. Inside, The warehouse was a cavern of wonders, arranged with the precision of a monastery scriptorium. Wooden chests lined the walls, each one labeled in Giovanni's careful script: pepper from Malabar, ginger from Java, silk from Constantinople, silver from Andalusia. The air itself seemed thick with value, every breath carrying hints of goods that had traveled further than most men would journey in a lifetime. "The Byzantines are getting nervous," Giovanni said, running his hand over a bolt of silk that caught the light streaming through the small window like captured sunlight. The silk he touched had begun its journey in workshops beyond the edge of the known world, carried by caravans across deserts and mountains whose names appeared on no map a European scholar would recognize. It had reached Constantinople in the baggage of an ambassador, been quietly sold to a Jewish trader who understood its true value, passed through several hands before arriving in this Venetian warehouse, where it waited for the next stage of its transformation from exotic treasure to Alpine contraband. But silk was only part of the story. The real foundation of Giovanni's business was information knowledge of which routes were safe, which officials could be trusted, which goods were in demand in markets hundreds of miles away. He maintained a network of correspondence that stretched from London to Cairo, merchants and ship captains and customs officials who shared intelligence about prices and opportunities, political developments and military movements that could open new possibilities or destroy existing arrangements overnight. "The German markets are hungry for Eastern goods," he continued, lifting a small leather pouch filled with saffron threads that looked like golden hair in the dim light. "The Emperor's latest campaign has brought back stories of Byzantine luxury, and everyone with silver wants a taste of what they've heard described. But the official routes are becoming impossible to many toll stations. Too many questions, too many officials who think every merchant is trying to cheat them." This was where the monastery connection became invaluable. Religious goods enjoyed special protection, under ancient laws that even the most rapacious local lord hesitated to violate openly. A shipment consigned to a monastery carried by men who could claim religious purpose, transported along routes that had been sanctified by pilgrimage. Such cargo could often pass through checkpoints that would strip a secular merchant of half his profits. Giovanni had cultivated these relationships carefully over the years, building trust with monastery sellers who understood that the church's spiritual mission sometimes required accommodation with worldly realities. He provided them with goods they needed: fine wine for the altar, precious metals for sacred vessels, spices for medicines and incense. In return, they offered him something more valuable than gold: legitimacy. The arrangement with Brother Aldrich had evolved naturally from smaller favors: a few bolts of silk for altar cloths, spices for the infirmary, silver for the monastery's growing library, transaction justified by genuine religious need, but serving also to establish the pattern of trust that would later support larger and more complex operations. The seller's reputation for honesty and careful record-keeping made him an ideal partner for a merchant, who understood that the most profitable businesses were those that could operate in the shadowy spaces between legitimate commerce and outright smuggling. The beauty of working with monasteries, Giovanni explained as he showed me a collection of small glass vessels filled with oils and unguents from the workshops of Alexandria, is that everyone assumes religious motivation. A secular merchant carrying Eastern luxuries raises questions about taxes and trade restrictions, but monastery supplies who questions the church's need for incense and medicinal herbs. Standing on the dock as our boat prepared for the journey back across the lagoon, I watched the lights begin to appear in the windows of the floating city. Each light represented a household, a workshop, a warehouse where someone was engaged in the great work of moving goods and wealth across the barriers that political authorities had erected. I remember the sound of Margot's voice cutting through the mountain wind, not loud but carrying with the authority of someone who had earned her place in this harsh landscape through decades of careful observation and patient survival. She stood at the edge of a cliff that dropped away into misty nothingness, one hand shading her eyes as she studied the valley below, where Count Heinrich's guards moved like dark specks along the official trade route. 3 of them today, she said, her weathered face showing no expression beyond professional interest. That's one more than usual. Either they're expecting something valuable, or word has gotten back to the Count about goods moving through his territory without paying proper tribute. The wind at this altitude carried the scent of snow even in late spring, mixing with the resinous smell of the pine trees that clung to impossible slopes all around us. We had been climbing since before dawn, following paths that appeared on no map and existed only in the accumulated knowledge of people like Margot, who had learned to read the mountains the way Brother Aldrich read his ledgers, with patience, attention to detail, and the understanding that small signs often revealed large truths. Her mules waited patiently behind us, their loads secured with the kind of knots that would hold against any weather the mountains might offer. These were not just pack animals to Margot. They were partners in an enterprise that required absolute trust between species. A mule that panicked on a narrow ledge could kill them both, while one that remained calm in a crisis could mean the difference between profit and disaster. She had raised most of these animals from foals, training them not just to carry loads, but to think, to make decisions, to understand that their survival depended on working together with their human companions. The relationship went deeper than simple economics. Margot's family had been moving goods through these passes for generations, before the current lords began demanding their endless tolls and taxes. Her grandfather had guided Roman merchants along routes that connected the Mediterranean world with the Germanic tribes beyond the Alps. Her father had carried Byzantine gold to Frankish kings and brought Saxon amber south to Italian workshops. The mountains had been their domain long before Count Heinrich inherited his title, long before Duke Berthold established his tax stations, long before Bishop Konrad began claiming ecclesiastical authority over trade routes that had existed since before the first Christian missionary crossed these peaks. The old Count understood the arrangement, Margot said, settling onto a fallen log where we could rest while keeping watch on the movements below. His tax collectors took their share from the official caravans, but they knew there were other paths, other ways goods could move through the mountains. Everyone made money, everyone survived, but his son, she shook her head with the resignation of someone who had seen too many changes in the mountain politics. Too many new authorities who thought they could control what had always been wild. The new Count had different ideas about order and control, where his father had been content to tax what he could see and ignore what remained hidden. Heinrich demanded exclusive authority over all movement through his territory. He had increased the number of guard stations, expanded the list of goods subject to taxation, begun offering rewards to informers who reported unofficial trading activity. The result was not the elimination of smuggling, but the transformation of a relatively peaceful arrangement into something more dangerous for everyone involved. But the mountains were vast, and human authority was necessarily limited. No count, however ambitious, could post guards on every trail, watch every pass, monitor every movement through terrain that stretched beyond the horizon in all directions. The official routes might be controlled, but there were always alternatives for those who knew where to look and had the skills necessary to use them. Margot knew them all. She carried in her memory a detailed map of paths that existed nowhere else, shepherd tracks that connected isolated valleys, hunting trails that followed ridgelines above the tree line, ancient routes that predated Roman roads and would outlast the current political arrangements. Some were seasonal, usable only when snow conditions permitted safe passage. Others were weather-dependent, requiring careful timing to avoid storms that could trap travelers for days in exposed locations. All of them demanded the kind of intimate knowledge that came only from years of patient observation and accumulated experience. "The guards know I exist," she said, watching a small patrol disappear behind a stand of trees far below. "They've seen me at markets, heard stories about the woman who can get goods through the mountains when the official routes are blocked. But they also know I'm careful, that I don't take unnecessary risks, that I've never been caught with anything that would justify the expense of a serious pursuit." This was the delicate balance that made her operation sustainable. She needed to be visible enough to attract clients who required her services, but not so prominent that she became a target worth pursuing. Her reputation was built on reliability rather than speed, on discretion rather than drama. Merchants who worked with her understood that their goods would arrive safely, but not necessarily quickly, that the routes she chose prioritized security over convenience. The network of relationships that supported her work extended far beyond simple commercial transactions. She knew which peasant families could be trusted to provide shelter during storms, which shepherds would report unusual guard activity, which village priests might be persuaded to bless loads that contained more than their manifests suggested. Many of these relationships were cemented by marriage and kinship ties that crossed the arbitrary boundaries lords had drawn on their maps. Margot's cousin served as a guard at one of Duke Berthold's checkpoint stations, a position that provided valuable intelligence about patrol schedules and enforcement priorities. The path led upward through deepening shadows toward passes that appeared on no official map, but that had carried travelers safely through these mountains for longer than anyone could remember. In this landscape of ancient patience and natural authority, Margot moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged completely to the place that had shaped her, carrying contraband toward distant markets with the same steady determination her ancestors had shown when they guided Roman legions and barbarian tribes through terrain that respected only those who understood its true nature. I remember the silence that fell over the mountains when the first heavy snows began, a hush so complete it seemed to muffle even the sound of my own breathing. The main passes that carried the great caravans of summer had closed weeks earlier, their approaches buried under drifts that would not yield until spring returned to wake the sleeping peaks. But for those who knew other ways, winter opened possibilities that the busy months concealed beneath their constant traffic of legitimate commerce. Margot stood beside the stone hut that served as our shelter, her breath forming clouds in the bitter air as she studied. the sky with the attention of someone whose life depended on reading weather signs correctly. The hut had been built by her grandfather's generation, positioned at the confluence of three valleys, where travelers could find protection during the harsh months, when the mountains became actively hostile to human presence. Its walls were thick stone, chinked with moss and mud. Its roof weighted with rocks that could resist the winds that swept down from the high places with force enough to lift a man from his feet. "The snow will hold for another day, maybe two," she said, squinting at clouds that hung like grey wool around the distant peaks. "After that, we'll have a window, perhaps a week, perhaps only 3 days. The route I'm thinking of hasn't been used since my father's time, but if the conditions are right, it could get us through while everyone else is waiting for spring." The route she described existed only in winter, when deep snow filled ravines and smoothed over obstacles that made passage impossible during other seasons. It was a path that required snow to be a path at all, following ridgelines that became highways of packed white when the conditions aligned properly. But those same conditions could shift without warning, transforming safe passage into mortal danger within hours of changing weather. Our cargo for this winter journey was smaller but more valuable than the summer loads that moved through the established passes. Giovanni had provided us with a collection of items that commanded premium prices in markets starved for luxury goods by months of isolation. Eastern spices that could transform preserved meat into something approaching palatability. Silk thread for the workshops that produced fine cloth during the long indoor months. Small quantities of precious metals that German craftsmen would transform into jewelry and religious ornaments. But the real value of winter smuggling lay not in the goods themselves, but in the market conditions their arrival would create. When spring finally opened the regular routes, early arrivals would find demand elevated by months of scarcity and prices inflated by the desperation of customers who had been waiting since the previous autumn for access to goods they could not produce locally. The risks, of course, were proportional to the potential rewards. Winter travel in the high mountains was always a gamble against weather, terrain, and the thousand small disasters that could strand travelers in places where rescue was impossible and death came quickly to those who made serious mistakes. Avalanches could sweep away entire caravans without warning. Sudden storms could trap travelers for weeks in exposed locations with insufficient supplies. Injuries that would be minor inconveniences in summer became life-threatening emergencies, when the nearest help was days away across impassable terrain. But Margot had been preparing for journeys like this since childhood, learning from her father and uncles who had carried goods through these mountains during the worst weather they could offer. She understood snow the way farmers understood soil reading, its texture and density, its age and stability, the subtle signs that revealed whether it would support the weight of laden mules or collapse into the deadly slides that could bury travelers beyond any hope of rescue. The mules chosen for winter work were different from their summer counterparts. These were smaller, hardier animals with thick coats and broad hooves that could find purchase on icy surfaces. They had been trained specifically for cold weather travel, accustomed to the special dangers of mountain winters and the need for absolute obedience when their guides' commands might mean the difference between safety and disaster. Each animal carried emergency supplies in addition to its commercial cargo extra rope, tools for cutting steps in ice, materials for building emergency shelters. We departed the stone hut before dawn on a morning when the stars seemed sharp enough to cut glass in the clear, cold air. The temperature was well below freezing, cold enough that exposed skin would begin to numb within minutes. But the sky was cloudless and the wind calm, conditions that Margot had been waiting for through 3 weeks of patient observation. The snow beneath our feet squeaked with the particular sound of powder dry enough to support weight without yielding, packed firm by its own density and the steady pressure of mountain winds. The route led upward through a landscape transformed by winter into something that seemed more like the surface of the moon than any earthly terrain I had known. Familiar landmarks disappeared beneath uniform whiteness, while new features emerged from the snow's ability to fill valleys and smooth irregular surfaces into flowing curves that revealed the underlying architecture of the mountains themselves. Trees became strange sculptural forms, their branches weighted with snow until they bent into shapes that looked more like prayers than living wood. Margot moved through this transformed world with the confidence of someone following a map written in a language only she could read. She identified route markers that were invisible to my eyes, the angle at which wind had carved snow around a particular rock formation, the way shadows fell across a slope at a specific time of day, the sound that ice made when it formed over running water versus the silence of snow lying over solid ground. Each sign was part of a complex navigation system that had been passed down through generations of mountain guides, refined by experience and verified by survival. The mules followed in single file, their hooves finding secure footing on surfaces that looked treacherously smooth to human eyes. Their breathing was visible in steady streams of vapor, but they showed no signs of distress despite the altitude and the demanding pace that Margot maintained. These animals understood winter travel with an instinctive wisdom that complemented their guides' learned skills, sensing dangers that might not be apparent until too late and responding to subtle commands that kept the entire caravan moving safely through terrain where a single misstep could prove fatal. By midday we had climbed above the tree line into a realm of rock and ice where the only sounds were the whisper of wind across snow and the steady rhythm of hooves breaking through the crust that had formed overnight. The sun was brilliant, but provided no warmth at this altitude, its light reflecting off snowfields with an intensity that could blind unwary travelers. Margot had provided us with pieces of darkened glass that reduced the glare, while allowing enough vision to navigate safely through the white maze that surrounded us. "The pass opens just ahead," she said, pointing toward what looked to me like an unbroken wall of snow-covered rock. "It's narrow, barely wide enough for the mules to pass single file, but it leads to the northern slope, where we can begin our descent toward the German valleys. If the weather holds, we'll be through the worst of it by tomorrow evening." The pass she indicated was indeed narrow, a cleft between towering peaks that seemed to have been carved by some giant knife into the living stone of the mountain. Snow had drifted into the opening, creating a passage that was half natural geology and half winter sculpture. The walls rose so steeply on both sides that only a few hours of direct sunlight reached the bottom, leaving most of the passage in permanent shadow where ice formed layers of treacherous beauty on every surface. We moved through this frozen corridor in careful single file, each footstep placed with deliberate precision on surfaces that could shift from solid footing to deadly trap without visible warning. The mules' hooves rang against hidden stones with metallic sounds that echoed strangely in the narrow space, creating brief conversations between our passage and the mountain's response. Above us, the sky was reduced to a narrow ribbon of blue, while ahead the passage curved out of sight toward whatever conditions awaited us on the northern slope. The air itself seemed different here, thinner and sharper, carrying scents of snow and stone that had been purified by months of cold into something that tasted almost metallic on the tongue. Each breath required conscious effort at this altitude, and I found myself counting steps to maintain the steady rhythm that would carry us through without exhausting our limited reserves of energy. This was no place for hurried movement or careless decisions. The mountains demanded patience and rewarded it with safe passage, while punishing haste with swift and final consequences. Emerging from the pass onto the northern slope was like stepping into a different season. Here the snow was softer, shaped by different wind patterns into formations that spoke of storms coming from the German plains rather than the Mediterranean warmth that influenced the southern faces of the peaks. The descent would be treacherous in its own way, requiring constant attention to surfaces that could give way without warning. But it offered the promise of gradual return to elevations where trees grew and human habitation became possible again. Margot allowed us a brief rest on a shelf of rock that provided some shelter from the wind, while offering a view of the valleys that stretched away toward the northern horizons far below. Invisible beneath layers of snow and cloud lay the markets where our cargo would transform from contraband into legitimate goods, where the spices and silk and precious metals we carried would find eager buyers who had been waiting through the long winter for access to luxuries that made the harsh season bearable. From here, it's all downhill, she said with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully navigated the most dangerous portion of a risky journey. 2 more days through country I know as well as my own hands. Then we'll reach the valleys where Giovanni's contacts are waiting with silver and stories about what the spring markets are likely to demand. The afternoon descent carried us through landscapes that revealed winter's artistry in forms that changed with every shift in light and shadow. As the sun began its early winter descent toward the western peaks, we reached elevations where scattered trees provided the first vertical landmarks we had seen since morning. By evening, we had descended far enough to find shelter among trees large enough to provide meaningful protection from wind, though the cold remained intense enough to require careful attention to fires and warm clothing. The stars that emerged after dark were different from those we had seen on the southern slopes, brighter, it seemed, and arranged in patterns that spoke of northern skies and the approach to regions where different skies, where different peoples lived, but beforbidden bows, but shed in ourselves. We can score be is in the mawa. Oh, well, I'm with a well, but I remember the sound of commerce before I could see the market, the low rumble of voices haggling in a dozen dialects, the creak of wagon wheels on cobblestones, the ring of silver changing hands in transactions that had been months in the making. The town of Augsburg spread before us in the grey dawn light, its timber and stone buildings rising from the morning mist like the dreams of merchants made solid. Each structure a testament to the wealth that flowed through this crossroads, where Alpine passes met the great rivers that carried goods toward the distant Baltic. Werner stood at the edge of the market square, his lean frame wrapped in a wool cloak that bore no outward signs of wealth, but was cut from cloth fine, enough to mark him as a man of substance to those who knew how to read such details. He had been waiting since before dawn, his pale eyes scanning the approaches to the square with the patient attention of someone who understood that successful commerce required careful timing and absolute discretion. The transformation from mountain contraband to legitimate merchandise had begun 3 days earlier, when our winter cargo was transferred from Margot's mules to Werner's wagons in a barn outside the town walls, where such exchanges could take place without attracting unwanted attention. The spices that had traveled hidden in grain sacks were now packed in proper wooden containers, labeled as medicinal herbs for the town's physicians. The silk thread that had crossed the Alps, disguised as monastery supplies, was wound onto spools and documented as materials for the workshops that produced altar cloths and religious vestments. But the most delicate transformation involved the silver-those Islamic dirhams that had journeyed from the markets of Baghdad to the shadow of monastery walls, and now waited to enter the legitimate economy of the German kingdoms. Werner's skill lay not just in his ability to move precious metals across borders, but in his understanding of how foreign currency could be absorbed into local markets without raising questions about origins or ownership. The beauty of silver, Werner had explained as we examined the coins by candlelight in his warehouse, is that value transcends politics. A Bavarian duke may distrust Islamic traders, but he will accept Islamic silver if the weight and purity meet his standards. Metal carries no memory of the hands that held it, bears no permanent record of the transactions that brought it to market. His warehouse occupied the ground floor of a building that faced the square, but maintained the appearance of modest prosperity rather than obvious wealth. The wooden sign above the door identified him as a dealer in metals and precious stones, a legitimate trade that provided perfect cover for the more complex operations that constituted the real foundation of his business. Inside, the walls were lined with chests and strong boxes that contained the raw materials of common silver bars, gold coins, copper, ingots, and the various gems and ornaments that wealthy Germans used to display their status and secure their fortunes. The morning market was already alive with activity when Werner led me through the maze of stalls and temporary shelters that transformed the square into a temporary city of commerce twice each week. Farmers from the surrounding countryside had brought grain and livestock, meat and cheese, the produce of the land that sustained the town's population through the long months when Alpine passes remained closed. But scattered among these practical vendors were dealers in more exotic goods merchants who had waited through the winter for the first caravans to arrive from the south, bringing luxuries that commanded premium prices from customers who had been calculating their desires since autumn. The spice vendor's stall occupied a prime location near the center of the square, its wooden counter displaying small piles of aromatic powders and dried leaves that had traveled further than most of the people examining them would journey in their lifetimes. The merchant, a stout man named Friedrich, whose family had been trading in exotic seasonings for 3 generations, ran the spices through his fingers with the expertise of someone who could identify origins and estimate values by texture and scent alone. Pepper from Malabar, he announced to a small crowd of prospective buyers, holding up a handful of the black corns that were worth more than their weight in silver in these northern markets. Cinnamon from Ceylon, cardamom from the mountains beyond the edge of the world. These arrived yesterday from Venice, carried through the Alps by traders brave enough to risk the winter passages. The crowd leaned forward, drawn by scents that spoke of distant lands and sophisticated cuisine. Among them I recognized the cook from Count Hermann's household, his purse heavy with silver that would purchase seasonings for the feast being planned to celebrate his lord's daughter's wedding. Beside him stood a physician whose medicines required imported ingredients, and a priest whose church was wealthy enough to afford incense that would carry prayers toward heaven on clouds of exotic fragrance. Each sale represented multiple transformations, spices that had begun their journey as contraband became legitimate inventory. Silver that changed hands created new relationships between buyer and seller, and goods that had moved in secret became public symbols of prosperity and sophistication. Friedrich recorded each transaction in a ledger that would satisfy any official inspection, but he also maintained the more complex accounting that tracked the true origins of his merchandise and the network of relationships that made such commerce possible. Werner watched these transactions with the satisfaction of someone seeing a carefully orchestrated plan unfold according to schedule. The spices had been purchased with silver that had traveled the same routes, creating a closed loop of value that generated profit at each stage, while obscuring the true origins of both goods and payment. The Islamic dirhams that had arrived hidden in salt sacks were now becoming German pfennigs in the hands of legitimate merchants, their foreign origins forgotten in the alchemy of commerce. The key, Werner explained as we moved through the crowd toward the section of the market where metalworkers displayed their wares, is understanding that money seeks its own level like water finding the sea. Restrict its movement in one direction and it will find another. Try to dam it completely and it will eventually overflow the barriers with destructive force. The metalworkers' quarter occupied the eastern edge of the square, where the sound of hammers on anvils provided a constant percussion to the quieter negotiations taking place at the merchants' stalls. Here, craftsmen who had learned their skills through generations of guild apprenticeship transformed raw materials into the objects that defined wealth and status in this northern world: silver cups for noble tables, gold jewelry for wealthy wives, copper vessels for monasteries and churches. Master Johann, a silversmith whose workshop had supplied 3 generations of local nobility, examined a selection of silver bars with the critical attention of someone whose reputation depended on the quality of his raw materials. The bars had been cast from Islamic dirhams in a process that removed all trace of their origins, while preserving the purity that made them valuable. Each bar bore Johann's own mark, certifying its quality and establishing the chain of ownership that would satisfy any official inquiry. "Excellent purity," Johann announced, running his thumb over the surface of one bar to feel the softness that indicated high silver content. "This will work beautifully for the communion set that Bishop Konrad has commissioned. The Church deserves vessels that reflect the glory of divine service, and silver of this quality will serve the altar for generations." The irony was subtle, but unmistakable: Islamic silver being transformed into Christian sacred vessels, foreign wealth becoming local religious art, contraband becoming consecrated objects that would hold the wine of the Eucharist. Werner observed this transformation with the detached interest of someone who understood that commerce respected no boundaries save those imposed by supply, demand, and the eternal human appetite for beautiful objects. The morning progressed through its familiar rhythms as goods changed hands and relationships were strengthened through successful transactions. The silk thread found its way to a workshop where skilled weavers would transform it into cloth fine enough for altar vestments or noble clothing. The remaining spices were distributed among customers, whose kitchens would be enriched by flavors that had traveled across continents to reach these northern tables. The precious metals entered the legitimate economy through channels that would carry them as far as the courts of kings and the treasuries of cathedrals. But Werner's operation involved more than simple conversion of contraband into legal goods. He maintained a network of correspondence that stretched from the Italian city-states to the courts of English kings, merchants and craftsmen who shared information about market conditions, political developments, and opportunities for profitable trade. A letter from a contact in London might reveal demand for specific goods that were difficult to obtain through official channels. Word from Paris could indicate political tensions that would affect trade routes and create new possibilities for those who understood how to exploit the resulting disruptions. Information is more valuable than any physical cargo, Werner said as we reviewed a collection of letters that had arrived with the week's legitimate mail carriers. A merchant who knows which German prince is planning a wedding, which bishop is building a new cathedral, which count is raising money for a crusade. Such a merchant can position himself to supply exactly the goods that will command premium prices. When the demand becomes urgent, this intelligence network was what made the winter journey worthwhile despite its extraordinary risks. By the time spring opened, the regular passes and commerce resumed its normal patterns. Werner would already know which goods would be in high demand, which markets would offer the best prices, which political developments might create opportunities for those positioned to take advantage of them. The premium prices that winter goods commanded were only part of the profit. The real value lay in the advanced knowledge that allowed smart merchants to position themselves ahead of their competitors. The afternoon brought different customers to the market wholesale buyers, who purchased goods for resale in smaller towns and villages throughout the region. Agents representing monasteries and noble households whose needs extended beyond what local producers could supply. Traveling merchants who were assembling cargoes for the spring trading season. Each transaction created new threads in the web of commercial relationships that connected this German market town to the wider world of Mediterranean commerce. Among these afternoon customers, I noticed several who bore the subtle signs of prosperity that suggested their own involvement in the shadow economy that paralleled legitimate trade. A cloth merchant whose fabrics showed quality that exceeded what his official sources could supply. A wine dealer whose cellars contained vintages from vineyards too distant to reach through documented channels. A jeweler whose collection of precious stones suggested access to materials that arrived through routes not recorded in any customs ledger. These men moved through the market with the careful discretion of people who understood that their prosperity depended on asking few questions and volunteering less information. They examined goods with practiced eyes that could assess quality without inquiring about origins, negotiated prices with the efficiency of those who understood that certain transactions were best completed quickly and forgotten immediately afterward. Werner dealt with them using a subtle code of gestures and implications that conveyed necessary information without ever stating anything that could be overheard by the wrong ears. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the market gradually transformed from a place of active commerce to one of quiet accounting and careful cleanup. Merchants counted their day's profits and planned their purchases for the following week. Craftsmen secured their workshops against theft while calculating which materials they would need to fulfill the orders they had received. The entire square hummed with the satisfaction of successful commerce and the anticipation of profits that would carry them through until the next market day brought fresh opportunities. Werner and I concluded our business as the last customers made their way toward home, carrying purchases that would enhance their tables or workshops or churches with goods that had traveled impossible distances to reach this northern market. The Islamic silver had become German currency. The Eastern spices had become ingredients for local kitchens. The Byzantine silk had become thread for German looms. Each transformation represented profit for someone, satisfaction for customers, and the continuation of commercial relationships that connected this small German town to the vast network of trade that spanned from England to Cathay. Standing in the quiet square as the market vendors completed their daily ritual of closing and securing, I reflected on the alchemy that had transformed our winter contraband into legitimate prosperity. The risks Margot had accepted in guiding us through winter passes, the care Brother Aldrich had taken in managing the monastery's involvement, the patience Giovanni had shown in assembling cargo that would find eager buyers, with these elderly Germans elderly in this orderly change chained, konings and decording to excorn to begin to relaken to get to be when to powerful to bond by with the by to get to get come with what do with a lot I remember the morning when Bishop Konrad arrived at the monastery unannounced, his entourage of clerks and guards creating an unusual commotion in the courtyard that normally knew only the quiet rhythms of monastic life. Brother Aldrich watched from the scriptorium window as the bishop's wagon was unloaded, his weathered face showing nothing of the calculations that must have been racing through his mind as he observed the unexpected inspection that had been months in the making. The bishop was a man of perhaps 50 winters, tall and lean, with the pale complexion of someone who spent his days in cathedral chambers rather than under mountain sun. His robes were fine wool dyed in deep purple, trimmed with silk that had probably traveled through channels similar to the ones we had been using, though he would never acknowledge such connections. His ring bore a sapphire that caught the morning light like captured sky, and his staff was carved from ivory that had journeyed from the distant lands where elephants walked beneath burning suns. Bishop Konrad's arrival was not entirely unexpected. Monastery sellers were required to submit annual accounts to their ecclesiastical superiors, and the wealth that our operations had brought to St. Bernulph's had grown difficult to explain through traditional sources of income. The community had prospered visibly over the past 2 years, acquiring new books for the library, fine vestments for the altar, improvements to the buildings that housed the growing number of pilgrims who sought shelter within these walls. But prosperity created its own dangers. Church officials who lived on modest benefices looked with suspicion upon monasteries that seemed to thrive without obvious explanation. Secular lords who struggled to extract taxes from their subjects noticed when religious communities appeared to possess resources that exceeded their documented income. Even emperors, engaged though they might be in their great contests with papal authority, occasionally turned their attention to local matters that seemed to challenge the proper order of wealth and power. Brother Aldrich descended from the scriptorium to greet his episcopal visitor, his brown habit freshly cleaned for the occasion, his manner composed with the careful dignity that 20 years of monastic life had taught him. The rule required hospitality toward all visitors, but there were visitors whose arrival brought joy and others whose presence demanded the kind of careful performance that could mean the difference between continued prosperity and ruinous investigation. "Your Excellence," Aldrich said, bowing with exactly the degree of deference that acknowledged the bishop's authority without suggesting subservience, "the community of St. Bernulph welcomes you. Our guest quarters are prepared, and Brother Thomas has arranged a feast suitable for your station." Bishop Konrad's pale eyes swept the courtyard, taking in details that might escape casual observation, but would be carefully recorded in the reports he would submit to higher authorities. The stone walls had been recently repointed with mortar that spoke of quality workmanship. The windows showed glass that was clearer than common abbey installations typically possessed. The horses in the stable bore the sleek condition of animals fed on grain rather than mere grass and hay. "I have come to review the monastery's accounts," the bishop said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to obedience, but also the caution of a man who understood that his own position depended on maintaining proper relationships with both ecclesiastical superiors and secular powers. "There have been ... inquiries about the source of St. Bernulph's recent prosperity. The inquiries had begun 3 months earlier, when Werner's success in the German markets had attracted attention from competitors, who wondered how a relatively unknown dealer in precious metals had suddenly acquired access to silver of exceptional purity. The questions had followed commercial networks backward through the Alps, creating ripples of curiosity that eventually reached officials whose duties included monitoring unusual flows of wealth across political boundaries. Count Heinrich had been the first to raise formal concerns, complaining to Duke Berthold that goods were moving through his territory without paying proper tribute. The Duke had passed these concerns to Bishop Konrad, whose ecclesiastical authority gave him both the right and the responsibility to investigate monasteries within his jurisdiction. The bishop, in turn, had received discreet inquiries from imperial officials who were beginning to wonder whether the church's tax exemptions were being exploited for purposes that extended beyond legitimate religious needs. Brother Aldrich led the episcopal party through corridors that had been carefully prepared for inspection, past chambers where books and vestments and sacred vessels displayed the monastery's commitment to appropriate religious purposes. But I noticed how his route avoided certain areas, the cellariums, deeper storage rooms, the workshops where lay brothers engaged in activities that might raise questions about the nature of monastery production, the guest quarters where travelers sometimes stayed longer than typical pilgrims and carried goods that bore no obvious connection to spiritual journeys. The bishop's clerks began their work with the methodical attention of men who had performed such audits many times before. They examined ledgers with practiced eyes that could identify discrepancies between recorded income and visible expenditure, questioned the brothers about sources of donations and patterns of commercial activity, requested documentation for purchases that seemed to exceed what a monastery's traditional resources could support. Brother Aldrich provided answers with the careful precision of someone who had spent months preparing for exactly this investigation. Each entry in his ledgers could be explained through legitimate channels: donations from grateful merchants, income from the monastery's agricultural holdings, fees collected from pilgrims who sought accommodation and spiritual guidance. The documentation was complete, the arithmetic accurate, the legal justifications sound according to both canon law and imperial regulation. But the bishops trained eye caught subtleties that simple accounting could not conceal. The monastery's wine cellar contained varieties from vineyards too distant to be easily explained by normal commercial relationships. The library included manuscripts that commanded high prices in scholarly markets, acquired through channels that seemed unusually efficient for a remote Alpine community. The quantity of precious metals in the chapel's sacred vessels suggested access to sources that extended beyond the donations typically available to rural monasteries. Your community has been blessed with remarkable prosperity, Bishop Konrad observed as he examined a gold chalice that had been crafted by Master Johann in Augsburg, its surface decorated with gems that had traveled from mines in distant kingdoms. Such wealth brings with it corresponding responsibilities to ensure that all activities remain within the bounds of proper religious conduct. The warning was subtle but unmistakable. The bishop had noticed inconsistencies that suggested commercial activity beyond what monastery exemptions were intended to cover. But he was offering Brother Aldrich an opportunity to address the situation before more serious sanctions became necessary. The Church preferred to resolve such matters internally when possible, avoiding the complications that arose when secular authorities became involved in ecclesiastical affairs. Brother Aldrich's response was equally careful, acknowledging the bishop's concerns while maintaining the position that all monastery activities served legitimate religious purposes. The goods that passed through St. Bernulph's warehouses were either monastery supplies or donations destined for charitable distribution. The relationships with merchants like Giovanni and Werner were simply practical arrangements that allowed the community to acquire necessary materials at favorable prices, while providing assistance to traders who faced difficulties with secular tax collectors. But as the day progressed and the bishop's investigation continued, it became clear that maintaining these explanations would require more than careful documentation and diplomatic language. Word of the episcopal visit had reached other interested parties, creating a convergence of attention that threatened to expose the entire network that had grown around the monastery's strategic position and Brother Aldrich's careful management. Count Heinrich's men had increased their patrols along the main passes, responding to rumors that significant quantities of untaxed goods were moving through their territory during times when legitimate trade was supposed to be minimal. Duke Berthold's tax collectors had begun asking questions about merchants who seemed to possess resources that exceeded their documented income. Even imperial officials were starting to take interest in reports of unusual commercial activity in regions where political authority remained contested between church and secular powers. The afternoon brought an unexpected complication when Margot arrived with a small caravan that had been delayed by weather in the high passes. Her timing could hardly have been worse. The bishop's clerks were still examining the monastery's records when her mules appeared in the courtyard, their loads carefully arranged to appear like routine supplies, but carrying goods that would be difficult to explain if subjected to detailed inspection. Brother Aldrich met this challenge with the smooth composure of someone who had learned to think quickly under pressure. The caravan was documented as bringing winter supplies that had been ordered months earlier, grain from valley farms, salt for preserving meat, wine from monastery vineyards in warmer regions. The manifests were accurate as far as they went, though they did not mention the silk threads wound inside, grain sacks, or the silver coins sewn into the padding that protected wine casks from breakage during transport. Bishop Konrad observed the unloading with professional interest, noting details that might become significant if his investigation revealed grounds for more serious intervention. But he also understood the delicate political balance that surrounded monastery operations in these contested borderlands, where church authority provided essential stability in regions where secular power remained fragmented and often ineffective. The community appears to manage its practical affairs with admirable efficiency, the bishop commented as he watched the systematic storage of goods that would sustain the monastery through the remaining winter months. Such competence in worldly matters should, of course, be balanced by equally careful attention to spiritual disciplines. The evening brought formal discussions that would determine the future of our carefully constructed operation. Bishop Konrad, Brother Aldrich, and the monastery's abbot met in the chamber where important decisions were traditionally made, their conversation illuminated by candles that cast moving shadows on stone walls that had witnessed similar negotiations over the decades since the community's founding. The bishop's position was clear. He had identified irregularities that suggested commercial activity beyond what monastery exemptions were designed to protect, but he was willing to overlook these inconsistencies in exchange for assurances that future operations would remain within acceptable bounds. The Church's authority in these mountain regions depended partly on maintaining good relationships with local communities, and St. Bernulph's had become too valuable as a center of learning and hospitality to risk destroying over questions about the precise nature of its commercial arrangements. Brother Aldrich's response acknowledged the legitimacy of episcopal concerns, while emphasizing the monastery's commitment to serving both spiritual and practical needs of the broader community. The relationships with merchants and traders were simply extensions of traditional monastic hospitality, providing assistance to travelers while generating resources that supported the community's religious mission. Any profits were used exclusively for purposes that glorified God and served the needs of pilgrims and local residents who depended on the monastery for services that no secular authority could provide. The negotiations continued through the evening hours, with both sides working toward an arrangement that would satisfy the bishop's need to demonstrate proper oversight while preserving the monastery's ability to continue operations that had brought prosperity to the entire region. The solution that emerged was characteristically medieval in its combination of practical accommodation and formal propriety. Monastery would accept closer episcopal supervision in exchange for official recognition of its special role in facilitating legitimate commerce in a special role in legitimate commerce in a region where secular authority remained warm. Where were with where I with with where on we go, we'll on with the side, But the bishop's visit had served notice that our network's success had attracted attention from authorities whose tolerance had limits that were now clearly defined. Future operations would require greater discretion, more careful documentation, and the kind of political sensitivity that recognized the difference between profitable accommodation and dangerous excess. The golden age of simple smuggling was ending, replaced by a more complex game that would reward those who understood the subtle difference between bending rules and breaking them beyond repair. As Bishop Konrad's entourage prepared for departure the following morning, his final words to Brother Aldrich carried both warning and opportunity. The Church would continue to support the monastery's mission, but that support depended on maintaining the appearance of propriety that kept secular authorities from questioning, ecclesiastical privileges that benefited far more than just the communities that exercised them directly. The episcopal wagons rolled away through morning mist that seemed to carry with them an era of comfortable ambiguity, leaving behind a world where success would require more sophisticated strategies and more careful attention to the political currents that could transform prosperity into persecution with a single misjudgment or the single misjudgment or moment of excessive ambition or moment of excessive obsessives of the pieces cells so will was so what where though I woke up on card I well with will up walk what's the boat walk I remember the bells beginning before dawn on the feast of St. Bernulf, their bronze voices cascading down from the monastery tower to wake the valley from its winter sleep. The sound carried across snow-covered fields and frozen streams, calling not just the faithful to prayer, but announcing to every merchant, pilgrim, and traveller within a day's journey that the monastery's greatest celebration had begun, a celebration that would provide perfect cover for the largest and most audacious shipment our network had ever attempted. Brother Aldrich moved through the pre-dawn darkness of the monastery with the measured pace of a man who had spent weeks planning every detail of this day. The feast of their patron saint brought hundreds of pilgrims to St. Bernulf's, transforming the normally quiet community into a bustling center of religious commerce where goods, money, and people flowed with a complexity that would mask even the most sophisticated smuggling operation. The saint's day fell precisely at the moment when winter's grip on the high passes was beginning to weaken, but had not yet released, entirely creating a brief window when determined travelers could move through routes that remained officially closed, while the spring trading season had not yet begun to crowd the lower roads with legitimate commerce. Giovanni had recognized this opportunity months earlier, assembling a collection of goods that would command extraordinary prices if they could reach the German markets. Just as wealthy customers emerged from their winter isolation, hungry for luxuries that money alone could not ordinarily procure. The cargo hidden in the monastery's deepest storage chambers represented the accumulated profits of an entire year's operations. Silk from workshops beyond Byzantium, where craftsmen, whose names would never be known, had woven thread into fabric that seemed to capture light itself. Spices from islands whose locations appeared on no European map, but whose products could transform the simplest meal into something approaching paradise. Precious stones from mines in mountains where different gods were worshipped, but whose gems caught fire in any light that touched them. But the true audacity of the shipment lay not in its individual components, but in its destination. Werner's contacts in the German courts had arranged for these goods to reach the wedding celebration of Duke Berthold's eldest daughter, the same Duke Berthold whose tax collectors had been investigating the unusual flows of wealth through his territory, whose officials had complained to Bishop Konrad about the monastery's suspicious prosperity. The irony was breathtaking in its complexity. Contraband that had evaded the Duke's taxes would now grace his daughter's wedding feast, purchased with silver that had originated in the very smuggling operations his men had been trying to suppress. The morning light revealed the transformation that a single night had wrought upon the monastery grounds. Pilgrims had been arriving since the previous evening, their campfires dotting the fields around the walls like earthbound stars, their voices adding a constant murmur of prayer and conversation to the usual mountain silence. Some had walked for weeks to reach this celebration, carrying their worldly possessions in simple bundles and their hopes for spiritual blessing in hearts that had been hardened by the difficult business of survival in a world where divine mercy seemed often overshadowed by human indifference. But among the legitimate pilgrims moved other figures whose presence served different purposes entirely. Merchants who had timed their journeys to coincide with the festival, understanding that religious celebrations provided opportunities for commerce that the ordinary market days could not match. Craftsmen who brought their wares to sell to visitors whose purses were loosened by the spirit of celebration. And scattered through this crowd, recognizable only to those who knew what signs to seek, were the agents and accomplices who would play essential roles in the day's more clandestine activities. Margot had positioned herself among a group of peasant women who had come to seek the saint's blessing for their families and livestock. Her weathered face and patched clothing allowing her to blend invisibly into the crowd, while her experienced eyes monitored the movements of officials and guards who might pose threats to the operation. Her mules were stabled with dozens of other animals in the temporary enclosures that had been erected to accommodate the festival's visitors, their loads documented as offerings for the poor and supplies for the feast that would feed hundreds of guests before the day concluded. The monastery's great hall had been transformed into something that rivaled the courts of princes, its stone walls draped with tapestries that told the story of Saint Bernulph's life in images that seemed to glow in the light of hundreds of candles. The tables groaned under the weight of dishes that showcased the monastery's hospitality. Roasted meats seasoned with spices that had traveled impossible distances, wines from vineyards whose names were whispered like prayers, breads baked from grains so fine they seemed to dissolve on the tongue like communion wafers. Brother Aldrich moved through this controlled chaos with the quiet authority of someone who had orchestrated every detail while maintaining the appearance of simple religious devotion. He blessed the food that would nourish bodies and souls, welcomed pilgrims whose donations would support the monastery's charitable works, and supervised the practical arrangements that kept hundreds of visitors fed, housed, and spiritually satisfied. But those who knew how to read the subtle signals could see him also coordinating the more complex activities that would transform this religious celebration into the culmination of months of careful planning. The crowd in the great hall provided perfect concealment for the kind of discreet conversations that advanced business more sensitive than the spiritual welfare of pilgrims' souls. Giovanni sat at a table with merchants whose interests extended far beyond religious devotion. Their discussion of trade routes and market conditions carried on in voices that blended seamlessly with the general hubbub of celebration. To casual observers, they were simply traders sharing information and fellowship during a break from their journeys. But their conversation dealt with the specific logistics of moving extraordinarily valuable cargo through territory where discovery would mean not just financial loss, but accusations of heresy and treason that could destroy everyone involved. Werner had arrived that morning disguised as a traveling goldsmith, his wagon loaded with religious ornaments and precious vessels that provided both legitimate cover for his presence and perfect concealment for the small fortune in converted Islamic silver that would finance the operation. His metalworking tools and samples of religious art gave him reason to examine and handle precious objects without arousing suspicion, while his reputation as a craftsman who served wealthy clients created natural opportunities for the kinds of private discussions that advanced arrangements too sensitive for public consideration. The afternoon brought the ceremony that justified the entire celebration, the public veneration of Saint Bernulph's relics, in a procession that wound through the monastery grounds and out into the fields where pilgrims had erected their temporary shelters. The saint's bones, preserved in a reliquary of gold and precious stones that caught the sunlight like captured fire, were carried by monks whose chanting voices rose above the crowd like prayers made audible. But for those involved in our more worldly enterprise, the procession served a different purpose entirely, as hundreds of pilgrims followed the holy relics through their prescribed route. Certain individuals moved in different directions entirely, making their way to locations where business could be conducted away from the crowds and the watchful eyes of officials who might recognize activities that extended beyond appropriate religious observance. The transfer took place in a barn beyond the monastery walls, where Margot's mules and Werner's wagons could meet without attracting attention from the festival crowds. The building had been chosen months earlier for its combination of concealment and convenience, close enough to the monastery that movement between them would not seem unusual, isolated enough that sensitive activities could proceed without unwanted witnesses, large enough to accommodate the complex choreography that would transform hidden contraband into legitimate cargo bound for ducal celebration. I watched as goods that had traveled from the edges of the known world were carefully transferred from their places of concealment to containers that would carry them toward their ultimate destination. Silk that had been hidden among grain sacks was rewound onto spools and packed in boxes labeled as altar cloth for the Duke's new chapel. Spices that had journeyed disguised as medicinal herbs were transferred to vessels marked as gifts for the ducal kitchens. Precious stones that had spent months concealed among common pebbles were set into jewelry that would adorn the bride at her wedding feast. Each item was documented with papers that would satisfy any inspection by officials who possessed the authority to examine goods traveling through their territory. The manifests listed origins that were technically accurate while concealing the true complexity of the routes these treasures had followed. The bills of sale recorded prices that reflected legitimate market values, while saying nothing about the premiums, commanded by goods that could only be obtained through channels that operated beyond the reach of conventional commerce. but the most delicate aspect of the operation involved managing the human relationships that made such complex transactions possible. The Duke's steward who would receive these goods had been carefully cultivated over months of smaller favors and discreet gifts, building the trust that would allow him to accept delivery without asking inconvenient questions about origins or authenticity. The guards who would escort the shipment had been selected not for their incorruptibility, but for their understanding that certain transactions benefited everyone involved and were therefore deserving of appropriate discretion. The evening feast provided the final opportunity for coordination and confirmation of arrangements that had been months in development. The great hall filled with voices raised in celebration of St. Bernulph's virtues, but scattered through the crowd were conversations that dealt with more immediate concerns, the timing of departures that would avoid unwanted encounters with patrol schedules, the routes that would carry precious cargo most safely through territories where authority remained divided among competing jurisdictions, the signals that would indicate successful completion of transactions that could not be publicly acknowledged. Brother Aldrich raised his cup in a toast that honored both the saint whose feast brought them together and more worldly arrangements that had made such prosperity possible. His words praised divine providence, while his eyes acknowledged the human ingenuity that had transformed religious celebration into commercial opportunity, spiritual devotion into practical profit, monastic hospitality into sophisticated smuggling operation that supplied luxuries to the very authorities whose policies had made such activities necessary. As the night deepened and the legitimate pilgrims began to settle into whatever shelter they could find, our more complex enterprise moved into its final phase. The wagons that would carry contraband disguised as wedding gifts were loaded and secured with the care due to cargo that represented not just financial investment, but the accumulated trust of relationships that had taken years to develop and could be destroyed by a single moment of carelessness or bad judgment. Margot checked the harness and loads with the methodical attention she brought to all mountain travel, but the stakes were higher than any winter passage through dangerous terrain. Discovery would mean more than death. In an avalanche, it would mean the kind of investigation that could unravel the entire network, destroying not just individual fortunes, but the delicate web of accommodations and understandings that had made their operation possible. Werner reviewed the documentation that would legitimate their cargo in the eyes of any official authority, each paper crafted with the precision of a master forger and the legal sophistication of someone who understood exactly which truths could be safely told and which realities required more creative interpretation. The success of the entire operation would depend on maintaining the appearance of conventional commerce while moving goods whose true nature and origins would create catastrophic complications if revealed at the wrong moment to the wrong authorities. The dawn departure took place under skies that promised clear weather for the mountain crossing conditions that Margot read as favorable for rapid movement, through passes that would remain dangerous despite the approaching spring. The procession that left the monastery grounds looked like any collection of merchants and craftsmen departing after a religious festival, their wagons loaded with ordinary goods and their manner suggesting nothing more dramatic than the usual business of supplying markets that had been depleted by winter's isolation. But hidden within this conventional appearance was cargo that represented the culmination of everything our network had learned about moving valuable goods across political boundaries, evading official attention, and transforming contraband into legitimate commerce through the patient application of human ingenuity to the eternal problem of connecting supply with demand across distances measured not just in miles, but in the complex geography of competing authorities and conflicting regulations. The bells of St. Bernulph continued their celebration as the wagons disappeared into the morning mist, carrying toward ducal wedding feasts luxuries that had begun their journey in workshops and mines at the edges of the world, traveled through the patient hands of merchants who understood that profit came to those willing to accept risks that more conventional traders could not contemplate, and would soon graze tables where their exotic origins would be forgotten in the simple pleasure of possessing beautiful things that spoke of sophistication and connection to the wider world beyond these mountain valleys. The Saints' Day feast had provided perfect cover for an operation of breathtaking audacity, transforming religious celebration into commercial triumph while maintaining the appearance of simple devotion that kept dangerous questions from being asked by authorities, whose tolerance had limits that our success was already beginning to test. And as I watched the last of the wagons vanish beyond the mountain ridge, carrying their precious burden toward destinations where luxury would be transformed once again into the simple pleasure of possession, I understood that we had achieved something far more significant than mere profit. We had proven that human ingenuity, properly applied to the eternal challenges of commerce and politics, could transform the most rigid boundaries into permeable membranes, the most vigilant authorities into unwitting accomplices, and the most sacred occasions into opportunities for the kind of worldly success that made all the risks and complications seem not just worthwhile, but inevitable. I remember the weight of silence in Bishop Konrad's private chamber, where the morning light filtered through glass that was clearer than any monastery should have possessed, casting patterns on stone floors that had been worn smooth by generations of abbots who had faced similar moments when the careful balance between spiritual duty and worldly necessity required delicate renegotiation. Brother Aldrich knelt before the bishop's chair, his brown habit freshly cleaned for this audience that both men knew would determine not just the monastery's future, but the fate of everyone whose lives had become entangled in the network that had grown around St. Bernulph's strategic position between the Italian wealth and German hunger. The cellarer's weathered hands remained steady as they always did when calculations of survival were required, but I could see in his shoulders the tension of a man who understood that this conversation would demand performance more subtle than any he had yet been required to give. Bishop Konrad sat with the careful composure of a man who had spent his ecclesiastical career navigating the treacherous currents between papal authority and imperial power, between spiritual ideals and political necessity. His purple robes spoke of rank that demanded respect, but his pale eyes held the wariness of someone who knew that his own position depended on maintaining relationships with forces, whose interests rarely aligned perfectly with those of the Church. The ring on his finger caught the morning light a sapphire that had probably traveled routes not entirely different from those our network had been using, though he would never acknowledge such connections. Brother Aldrich, the bishop, began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had learned to speak carefully, when words could be reported to higher powers. Your monastery has attracted attention that extends beyond my own pastoral concerns. Duke Berthold has raised questions about the source of St. Bernulph's prosperity. Count Heinrich has complained about goods moving through his territory without proper tribute. Even imperial officials have begun to inquire about whether church privileges are being exercised within appropriate bounds. The accusations hung in the air between them like incense, carrying implications that could transform comfortable arrangements into catastrophic investigations. But Brother Aldrich had been preparing for this moment since the first silver coin crossed the monastery threshold, disguised as a donation for the poor. His response came with the precision of someone who had spent months crafting explanations that were both completely truthful and utterly incomplete. "Your Excellence," Aldrich said, his voice steady with the calm that 20 years of monastic discipline had bred into his bones. "The monastery has indeed been blessed with prosperity, but every transaction has been conducted according to both canon law and imperial regulation. Our ledgers record each donation received, every purchase made, all expenditures for the community's spiritual and temporal needs. If secular authorities question our good fortune, perhaps they might also examine their own policies that make legitimate commerce so difficult that merchants seek sanctuary in places where ancient privileges still offer some protection against endless taxation." The bishop's eyebrows rose slightly at this response, which acknowledged the reality of the situation, while placing responsibility for its existence on the very authorities who now complained about its consequences. It was an argument with dangerous implications, suggesting that church privileges existed partly to provide refuge from secular policies that had grown oppressive beyond reasonable bounds, but it was also one that might resonate with an ecclesiastical authority who had his own reasons for resenting imperial interference in church affairs. "The arrangement has certain practical advantages," Bishop Konrad said slowly, his words chosen with the care of someone testing the boundaries of what could be safely acknowledged. "Monasteries in border regions do face challenges that their brothers in more settled territories need not consider. The hospitality required by our rule sometimes necessitates relationships with merchants and traders whose business extends beyond simple spiritual matters." I watched this careful dance of diplomatic language, each man probing to discover how much the other was willing to acknowledge about realities that could not be spoken directly. The bishop needed to demonstrate proper oversight to his own superiors while protecting an operation that served interests extending far beyond the monastery's walls. Brother Aldrich needed to maintain the fiction of simple religious devotion, while securing continued protection for activities that had become essential to the community's survival and prosperity. The conversation continued through the morning hours, with both sides gradually revealing the true scope of what they understood and what they were prepared to accept. The bishop had clearly conducted his own investigation, gathering information that went far beyond the monastery's ledgers to encompass the network of relationships that connected St. Bernulph's to merchants in Venice, traders in Germany, and the complex web of accommodations that made large-scale smuggling possible. But he had also discovered something that Brother Aldrich had not fully anticipated. The operation's success had created benefits that extended far beyond the monastery itself. The prosperity that flowed through these mountain passes had enriched entire communities, providing employment for guides like Margot, income for craftsmen like Master Johann, opportunities for merchants like Werner, who might otherwise have struggled to compete in markets dominated by larger, more established trading houses. The regional economy has grown substantially, Bishop Konrad observed, consulting notes that suggested his investigation had been far more comprehensive than anyone had realized. Tax revenues to secular authorities have actually increased, despite their complaints about goods moving through unofficial channels. The stability that prosperity brings to border regions serves imperial interests, even when that prosperity originates in activities that might not bear close examination by customs officials. This was the opening that Brother Aldrich had been hoping for. Acknowledgement that the network's activities served broader purposes that transcended simple questions about tax avoidance or regulatory compliance. The wealth that moved through these mountains strengthened communities that might otherwise have been vulnerable to the political instability that plagued regions where authority remained contested between church and secular powers. The monastery has always sought to serve the broader community, Aldrich replied, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had found ways to reconcile competing loyalties. Our relationships with merchants and traders allow us to provide services that no secular authority has been able to offer: safe passage for valuable goods, reliable storage for items that require security, neutral ground where business can be conducted between parties who might not otherwise trust each other. The afternoon brought more detailed negotiations as both sides worked toward an arrangement that would satisfy the bishop's need to demonstrate proper oversight while preserving the monastery's ability to continue operations that had become too valuable to abandon. The solution that emerged was characteristically medieval in its combination of practical accommodation and formal propriety. The monastery would accept increased episcopal supervision, submitting more detailed accounts of its commercial activities and allowing periodic inspections by church officials who would ensure that all transactions remained within acceptable bounds. In exchange, Bishop Konrad would provide formal recognition of the monastery's special role in facilitating commerce in a region where secular authority remained inadequate to the complex needs of international trade. But the arrangement went deeper than simple administrative oversight. The bishop revealed that his own position had been strengthened by the success of operations like ours. Church authorities in Rome had noticed that regions under effective ecclesiastical supervision tended to prosper in ways that purely secular territories did not, creating arguments for expanded church involvement in commercial regulation that served broader papal interests in the ongoing contest with imperial power. The Holy Father has observed, Bishop Konrad said, with the careful discretion of someone conveying information that could not be officially acknowledged, that church privileges tend to promote stability and prosperity in ways that benefit all legitimate interests. When monastic communities serve as centers of learning, hospitality, and commerce, they create conditions that serve both spiritual and temporal needs. This was as close as he could come to acknowledging that our operations had PayPal approval, or at least PayPal tolerance, based on their contribution to church authority in regions where that authority faced challenges from secular powers. The success of smuggling networks like ours demonstrated the practical value of ecclesiastical privileges, creating arguments for their preservation and expansion that served purposes far beyond the immediate interests of any single monastery. Brother Aldrich received this information with the composure of someone who understood that survival in the complex world of medieval politics required the ability to serve multiple masters simultaneously. The monastery's operations would continue, but they would now carry additional significance as demonstrations of church effectiveness in areas where secular authority had proven inadequate or oppressive. The evening brought private discussions that sealed arrangements too sensitive to be documented in any official record. Bishop Konrad made clear that his protection extended beyond simple administrative oversight to include active assistance with problems that might threaten the network's continued operation. Church authorities would use their influence with secular powers to deflect investigations that posed serious dangers, while monastery operations would provide intelligence about political and economic developments that served broader ecclesiastical interests. But protection came with obligations that went beyond submitting detailed accounts and accepting periodic inspections. The monastery would be expected to accommodate church needs that extended beyond its own. Immediate interests providing storage and transport for goods that served episcopal purposes, offering sanctuary to individuals whose activities supported church policies, maintaining relationships with merchants and traders whose information could be valuable to ecclesiastical authorities. The arrangement serves everyone's interests, Bishop Konrad concluded as the negotiations reached their final form. The monastery continues its profitable operations under church protection. Secular authorities receive the economic benefits that flow from increased prosperity while remaining officially ignorant of activities they prefer not to examine too closely. The Church demonstrates its practical value in ways that strengthen arguments for preserved privileges and expanded authority. I remember the moment when both men rose from their chairs, their agreement sealed by handshakes that carried the weight of understanding, reached between professionals who recognized the complex realities of survival in a world where spiritual ideals had to accommodate practical necessities. The monastery would continue its operations, but those operations would now serve purposes that extended far beyond the community's immediate needs. As Bishop Konrad prepared for his departure the following morning, his final words to Brother Aldrich carried both warning and promise. The arrangement would be honored as long as operations remained discreet and profitable. But any development that attracted unwanted attention from imperial authorities or created problems for church policies would result in swift abandonment of protection that depended on mutual benefit rather than spiritual obligation. The episcopal wagons disappeared into morning mist that seemed to carry with them the last vestiges of simple smuggling, leaving behind a more complex world, where success would require constant attention to political currents that could transform allies into enemies with changes in papal policy or imperial priorities. But it was also a world where the network's operations enjoyed protection more powerful than any secular authority could provide, backed by an institution whose interests spanned kingdoms and whose influence reached from Alpine valleys to the courts of distant princes. Brother Aldrich returned to his ledgers with renewed purpose, understanding that the numbers he recorded now served causes that extended far beyond monastery walls. Each transaction would be documented with the precision required by episcopal oversight, but it would also contribute to arguments for church authority that echoed in councils where the fate of kingdoms was decided by men who understood that practical success often mattered more than theoretical orthodoxy. The morning bells called the community to prayer as they had for generations, but their bronze voices now carried additional significance, not just the hours of divine service, but the continuing success of arrangements that served both spiritual and temporal masters with the flexibility that survival in medieval politics demanded. The confession had become compromise, and compromise, and compromise, and compromise had become the foundation, had become subservices, larges, purposes, prosperous. Prosperity while preserving the essential, especially with sense serble. Basel with semel with sapple well with the with well with the with well with do well and will Smug, I got the fourth two precious borders with split with the move and both of In the scriptorium, Brother Aldrich opened his ledgers to record another day's entries in the careful script that had carried the monastery through transformation from simple religious community to crucial component in networks that connected Italian wealth to German markets, while serving ecclesiastical policies that reached far beyond these mountain valleys. The numbers told their double stories, with practiced deficiency, another synodation, another synothers, another stationals, besessionously not-situation, proportion accuses signito, Bofinison with a submission, Pelinsimisisl and Besissimbensisil, Wesico, buried in the will and all, without and with all, whistle will ever go I remember the first morning when the mountain wind carried the scent of melting snow and new grass, when the passes that had been locked in winter's grip for half the year began to stir with the promise of movement and renewal. The bells of St. Bernulph's rang across valleys where streams ran loud with snout, their bronze voices announcing not just the hour of morning prayer, but the return of the season when goods and gold would flow through these ancient channels with the inevitability of water seeking the sea. Brother Aldrich stood in the monastery courtyard, his weathered face turned toward the peaks, where patches of bare stone were beginning to emerge from their white shrouds like islands rising from a receding flood. The winter had been long and profitable, but spring brought different opportunities and different dangers. The return of official caravans that would crowd the main routes, the resumption of regular patrols that would make unofficial movement more challenging, and the eternal need to adapt methods that had served well in one season to the changed conditions that another would bring. The arrangement with Bishop Konrad had held through the winter months, creating a framework of protection and oversight that allowed operations to continue while serving purposes that extended far beyond the monastery's immediate interests. Church authorities had indeed provided assistance when secular officials grew too curious about unusual prosperity, deflecting investigations through the kind of quiet influence that ecclesiastical power could exercise when properly motivated. But spring would test whether accommodations reached in winter chambers could survive the more complex challenges that active trading seasons always brought. Margot appeared in the gateway as she had so many times before, but now she carried herself with the subtle confidence of someone whose position had been legitimized by forces more powerful than any local authority. The bishop's recognition of the monastery's special commercial role had extended protection to the network's key participants. transforming guides and traders who had operated in legal shadows into acknowledged components of arrangements that served church policy in regions where spiritual and temporal authority remained intertwined. Her mules looked sleek and well-fed after months of monastery care, their thick winter coats already beginning to shed in preparation for the warmer work ahead. But these were no longer simply pack animals belonging to a mountain guide of questionable reputation. They were now part of an operation that enjoyed episcopal approval and the protection that such approval could provide, against secular authorities whose policies had made unofficial commerce necessary in the first place. The passes are opening earlier this year, Margot said, running her experienced hands over the lead. Mule's neck with the familiar gesture of someone checking for the subtle signs that indicated readiness for difficult work. The southern routes will be clear within the week, and word from Giovanni suggests that Venetian warehouses are bursting with goods that have been accumulating through the winter months. The spring markets should offer opportunities that will make the risks worthwhile. But the risks had indeed changed, becoming in some ways greater and in others more manageable than they had been in the simpler days, when success depended only on avoiding the attention of local officials whose authority was limited and whose interests could be accommodated through careful negotiation. The network now operated under the watchful eye of church authorities, whose protection came with expectations that extended beyond simple commercial success to include service to ecclesiastical policies that reached far beyond these mountain valleys. Giovanni's latest letter, carried by a messenger who had risked the dangerous early season crossing, described conditions in Venice that promised extraordinary profits for those who could move goods quickly to markets that had been starved of luxury items through the long winter months. The wedding of Duke Berthold's daughter had created demand for similar goods among other noble families who wished to demonstrate their own sophistication and wealth. German courts that had spent the winter months planning celebrations and ceremonies now competed for access to the Eastern luxuries that would make their events memorable. But Giovanni's letter also carried warnings about increased scrutiny from Venetian authorities, who had begun to notice the efficiency with which certain goods disappeared from official warehouses, only to reappear in northern markets without having passed through documented trade channels. The success of operations like ours had attracted imitators who lacked the careful discretion and established relationships that made complex smuggling sustainable over extended periods. Werner's reports from the German markets told a similar story of opportunity tempered by increased danger. The silver that had been converted from Islamic dirhams to local currency had indeed reached Duke Berthold's daughter's wedding, where it had been transformed into gifts that enhanced the Duke's reputation for magnificence while demonstrating the prosperity that his policies had brought to his territories. But the success had also attracted attention from imperial officials who wondered how a relatively remote Alpine region had suddenly gained access to luxury goods that commanded premium prices in the most sophisticated markets. The emperor's tax collectors are asking new questions, Werner wrote in the coded language that had become necessary for sensitive correspondence. They want to understand how certain regions have become so prosperous, while others struggle to meet their traditional obligations. Success creates its own problems when it becomes too visible to ignore. The challenge was familiar to anyone who had operated in the grey zones between legal commerce and outright criminality. how to maintain profitable operations while avoiding the kind of success that attracted unwanted attention from authorities, whose tolerance had limits that were defined more by political necessity than legal principle. The protection that Bishop Konrad provided was real but not unlimited, dependent on maintaining the delicate balance between usefulness and danger that kept church interests aligned with network operations. Brother Aldrich had spent the winter months developing new methods that would allow the network to adapt to its changed circumstances, while preserving the essential activities that made it valuable to all parties involved. The monastery's ledgers now recorded transactions with the precision required by episcopal oversight, but they also documented a more sophisticated operation that served purposes extending far beyond simple tax avoidance. The spring routes would carry more than goods. They would transport information that served church intelligence gathering, provide channels for communication between ecclesiastical authorities in different regions, offer opportunities for the kind of discreet diplomacy that allowed church officials to influence secular policies without direct confrontation. The network's commercial success had created capabilities that could serve papal interests in the ongoing contest between ecclesiastical and imperial authority, but serving multiple masters required constant attention to the competing demands that could transform allies into enemies. If conflicting interests were not carefully managed, the same discretion that protected commercial operations from secular interference could also conceal activities that served church purposes secular authorities would find threatening. Success required walking the narrow line between usefulness and danger that defined survival in the complex world of medieval politics. The afternoon brought visitors who demonstrated how the network had evolved to serve these broader purposes. A party of Benedictine monks from a monastery near the German border arrived ostensibly to consult the library's collection of theological texts, but their real purpose involved coordinating intelligence gathering that would keep church authorities informed about political developments in regions where imperial and papal authority remained in competition. Their leader, Brother Marcus, was a man of perhaps 60 winters, whose scholarly reputation provided perfect cover for activities that extended far beyond simple theological research. His questions about manuscript collections served as codes for discussions about political movements, trade disruptions, and military preparations that could affect church interests throughout the region. The Emperor's latest campaign has created opportunities, Brother Marcus observed while examining a treatise on canon law that dealt with church authority over commercial activities. Secular authorities are preoccupied with military objectives, creating space for ecclesiastical influence in areas that have been contested for generations. The coded conversation continued through the evening hours, with Brother Aldrich providing information about merchant activities and trade patterns that revealed political and economic conditions across the territories their network served. The intelligence that flowed through commercial channels was often more accurate and current than what official diplomatic sources could provide, making the network valuable to church authorities whose policies required detailed understanding of conditions in regions where their influence competed with secular power. As the monks prepared to continue their journey toward other monasteries in their circuit, they carried with them more than theological insights. They transported commercial intelligence, political observations, and strategic assessments that would inform church policies from Rome to the Baltic. The spring routes served purposes that transcended simple trade, creating channels for influence that complemented the spiritual authority that remained the Church's primary source of power. The following weeks brought the gradual resumption of normal trading patterns, as winter's grip finally released the high passes and legitimate commerce began its annual cycle of moving goods between Italian wealth and German markets. But the network's operations had evolved to work within these patterns rather than simply around them, finding ways to blend unofficial activities with legitimate trade in arrangements that served everyone's interests while maintaining the appearance of conventional monastery hospitality. The spring caravans that stopped at St. Bernulph's carried both legal and illegal cargo, their manifests accurately describing some goods while remaining silent about others that traveled under the protection of church privileges and episcopal oversight. The monastery's guest quarters accommodated legitimate pilgrims alongside merchants whose spiritual motivations were mixed with more worldly concerns, creating communities of temporary convenience where business could be conducted according to the complex rules that governed commerce in regions where authority remained divided among competing jurisdictions. Margot's role had expanded beyond simple guide and smuggler to include coordination of activities that served church intelligence, gathering, and diplomatic communication. Her knowledge of mountain routes and local conditions made her valuable for moving people and messages that required the kind of discretion that official channels could not provide, while her network of relationships among guides, peasants, and local officials created opportunities for gathering information that complemented what commercial activities revealed about political and economic conditions. The work has become more complex, she observed during one of our planning sessions, but also more secure. When powerful people find your activities useful, they have reasons to protect you that go beyond simple profit. The Church has interests that extend far beyond these mountains, and success here serves purposes that reach to Rome itself. The spring routes carried more than goods and intelligence. They transported a vision of how regional prosperity could serve broader institutional purposes while maintaining the local autonomy that made complex operations sustainable. The network had evolved from simple smuggling operation to sophisticated system that served spiritual, political, and commercial interests simultaneously while preserving the essential activities that made such service possible. As the season progressed and summer approached with its promise of increased activity on all the major trade routes, I reflected on how winter's necessities had been transformed into spring's opportunities. The arrangements that began as survival strategies had become integral components of systems that served purposes larger than any individual's immediate interests, while preserving the essential human relationships that made complex cooperation possible across political boundaries and cultural differences. The mountain roads continued to carry their ancient traffic merchants seeking profit, pilgrims pursuing salvation, officials exercising authority, but they now also served purposes that connected these remote valleys to the great currents of medieval politics and commerce. Success had created obligations and opportunities that extended far beyond the simple movement of goods, across dangerous territory to encompass service to institutions whose interests spanned kingdoms and whose influence reached from Alpine monasteries to papal courts. Brother Ulrich's ledgers recorded these evolving complexities with the precision that episcopal oversight required, but they also documented something more significant: the transformation of necessity into opportunity, survival strategy into institutional service, local accommodation into regional influence. The numbers told stories that reached beyond monastery walls to touch the lives of everyone whose prosperity depended on the patient movement of valuable things across distances measured not just in miles, but in the complex geography of competing authorities and conflicting loyalties. The bells of St. Bernulph's continued their ancient rhythm, calling the faithful to prayer while announcing the success of arrangements that served both spiritual and temporal masters with the flexibility that survival in medieval politics demanded. Spring had brought renewal and adaptation, demonstrating once again that successful institutions learned to serve multiple purposes simultaneously while preserving the essential activities that made such service both possible and profitable. In the mountains, the snow continued its retreat toward the high peaks, revealing paths that would carry the summer's traffic toward destinations that had been chosen months earlier by men who understood that patient planning and careful relationship management could transform dangerous enterprises into sustainable successes. The ancient stones of Roman roads waited to bear new cargo toward markets that hungered for goods that could only be obtained through channels that operated in the spaces between official jurisdictions and acknowledged authorities. The spring routes stretched ahead like promises of continued prosperity and expanding influence, carrying goods and information, people and purposes through networks, through network worlds, where worldwall article necessitual necessital negotial negokal necatual nequatal kilo well kakoma wo to The mountain roads had found their rhythm once again, ready to bear whatever cargo that changing seasons and shifting political currents might require of those who understood that survival often meant serving purposes larger than immediate self-interest, while preserving the essential human activities that made civilization possible in places where the margin between success and disaster remained as narrow as the paths that carried travelers safely through the high places where different worlds met and learned to accommodate each other's, where different worlds met and learn to accommodate each other's need. Sleep, sleep well, There are more stories to come.